Thanks so much for coming out. I hope your first day is going well so far. I know there's a lot. How many folks did workshops this week already? All right, so a few hands. Yeah, brains are already fairly cooked. 5 days is a long time. If you did 2 days of workshops and 3 days worth of conferences by Friday, you need to relax a little. This is a bit more of a fun talk, although we count on this infrastructure all the time, whether we know it or not, and there's lots to learn about. My name's Richard Campbell. I make a lot of podcasts, so any .NET Rocks listeners in the room? Oh, yeah, oh, thank you, that's very kind. And a number of guests as well. So my friend Carl Franklin started .NET Rocks back in 2002, so we predate the word podcast by a couple of years. That's why we call it an internet audio talk show, because we're not clever enough to come up with the word podcast. I started Run As in 2007 because I wasn't happy with the podcasting content for sysadministrators, so that's every Wednesday since April 11th, 2007, so there's something like 1,000 of those now. And we're almost at 2,000 for .NET Rocks. And those are interview shows. We find smart folks, many of them you'll see this week, and have a conversation about the technologies they care about. For a brief interval, we made a show called The Tablet Show, where we weren't sure where to talk about tablets. We did that for a few years, and then we just rolled it into .NET Rocks. Part of .NET Rocks, since about 2011, were these shows we called Geek Outs. And they were whatever geeky subject, typically in space or alternative energy, things like that. And so there's about 100 of those now. And I've had a number of cool opportunities around making those shows, including presentations to NASA and to other energy companies and so forth. So if you're interested in that kind of thing, the Geek Outs are a separate collection of .NET Rocks episode. This talk would normally be considered a Geek Out, except I've never done it as a podcast. This is a first, where originally I made podcasts, and then people would ask me to make them into talks. So I've done a bunch of space and energy-related talks. Last year I did nuclear power here, specifically tuned to the UK, talked about Hinkley Site C and things like that. But this talk I have not yet done as a podcast yet. We forget how essential this network is. There's about 1,700 operating undersea cables around the planet right now. And I'm just going to say cables in general, because there's also oil pipelines and electrical transmission and other kinds of specialty sensors arrayed under the ocean floor. Virtually anything you do on the internet travels under the ocean at some point. It's almost all of the data. And it starts with electricity, and actually starts in England. So the first undersea cables were electrical cables. This is the middle 1800s. So we're only getting into making electricity relatively efficiently, and immediately we're trying to move it around under the ocean, because electricity's fun, let's put it under the ocean. And so the first cables were actually between England and France. They didn't work particularly well. They didn't have good coatings. They were using gutta percha to try and seal these wires away. And so they're lucky if they lasted a year, but the experimentations got better and better over a few years. And it's crazy to think that we only really had electrical motors in the 1820s. So by the 1840s, we're making enough of it that we're trying to push it around under ocean. So it happened pretty fast. The first really reliable cable was between Dover and Calais by 1850. So this is actually a picture of a piece of the original cable that had subsequently failed and been pulled back up, just to show this is where they're moving things around. There's not a big stretch from electricity to telegraph. Telegraph is just pulsed electricity. And so the first cables that start running under the ocean are in that same time span. So we do 1850, we put it under the English Channel. By 1860, we're doing transatlantic cables. So the first one was in 1858. It took about 3 years to put it down. It broke a couple of times along the way, and they repaired it and continued laying it down. And when they finished installing it, going all the way to Newfoundland, then they tried to use it, and it didn't perform particularly well. They weren't happy with the quality of the data, the rate of signal that they were pulsing through it, so the correct answer was turn up the voltage. And they kept doing that until they burned the wire. And so it lasted about 6 weeks or so, and then that was the end of that. They relayed a new one in 1865 that had storm problems and ultimately failed. By 1866, the third attempt was the first really functional transatlantic cable. This is for telegraph. And the news story in the papers was from 2 weeks to 2 minutes. We take for granted that we now have these supercomputers on us that allow us to communicate to any person anywhere in the world. Before that transatlantic telegraph cable in 1865, if I wanted to communicate from the US to England, I wrote a letter and stuck it on a ship. And that ship took 2 or 3 weeks to get there, and then hopefully you'd write back. Like, that's some bad ping time. And now we had a Telegraph, and for about $100 in current currency, you could send about 200 characters worth of information in Telegraph and pay more for more, 2 minutes. So it was a breakthrough. It was a tremendous breakthrough. And this is actually a map of the Telegraph network as of 1901. So it was from the first cables working in 1865. In a period of 30 years, we laid cable all over the world. It was that powerful a tool that we'd go to the expense to lay cable. That was, by the way, the cables laid for one company, the Eastern Telegraph Company. So there were actually more. If we fast forward a bit, it's 1901 is an interesting, the fact that this map, that was also the year that Marconi first does his wireless transmissions across the Atlantic. So we had telegraph working before we were able to do Morse code across the air. If you fast forward to sort of the next area of undersea networking, it's actually petroleum products. The petroleum oil specifically is found in quantity in the US in the early 1900s, around 1900, and most of them just working from the land. But the idea of moving petroleum products under the water really starts in World War II. It's part of D-Day. So they did the math for D-Day and realized that 60% of all of the cargo that was going to be needed to be moved from England to France was going to be petroleum products, lubricants, oil, gasoline. And so rather than stick it on ships with all of that challenge and time and difficulty, what if we put it through pipes? And so they modified these cargo ships with big spools of pipe to lay under the strait, under the channel, in actually 2 points. You can tell this was an American project because it was codenamed Operation Pluto, and it had 2 lines, the Dumbo line and the Bambi line. It's all Disney characters. Multiple pipes laid side by side that would pump these products down, and they actually extended the lines over the course of post-D-Day all the way into Germany. And again, moved millions of tons of petroleum products through the pipes rather than trying to ship them. Now, after the war was over, most of this piping was scrapped and reused for other things, although if you're interested in this stuff, I've seen photographs of, there's a couple of sites left on the Isle of Wight that was a landing station for the Dumbo pipelines down to the southern part of France. So if you want to take a look at it, it's out there. So that, although it was a brief interval, just a few years of them doing that, most of that got taken back up. Regular pipelines come a little later. In the 1950s, as the easy oil is largely being picked up in the Permian Basin in the United States, they start exploring into the Gulf of Mexico. Gulf of America? Gulf of Mexico. This is the 1950s. This was the original rig. So this is basically a modified land rig on a floating barge assembly they called Mr. Charlie. It was only good up to about 10, 15 meters of water, but they started to do oil extraction on the water side. This technology has advanced massively now in the 1970s with all of the work by British Petroleum and the Norwegians to do deep water networks of cables so that you can build extraction points out at sea, combine them together. It looks like a network. And understand these are quite bidirectional. As you're removing oil from a basin, you'll pump brine or salt water back into it to keep the land under equal pressure. And you can do gas separation under the water. You can do oil separation. A lot of that processing happens down on these heads. Today, they're largely handled by ROVs. There once was divers on all of this. And then up to floating mounts that will be moved by ship or onto rigs for pre-processing before distribution. So we have a massive network in certain parts of the world of pipelines for moving petroleum products around and doing their extraction. These pipes are large, meter and a half in diameter, typically coated in concrete, some kind of cement to deal with abrasion. They're sitting on the bottom. Currents will move things around. And occasionally, the ocean floor is not automatically stable. There's a lot of bumping around. And so these pipes tend to be big, quite robust, and last just fine. But moving away from oil back to our communications side to get past telegraph, in the 1960s we get to telephony and the first of the transatlantic telephone cables. So TAT-1 was laid in the mid-50s, 2 cables run side by side, finished by 1956, could handle 35 telephone calls and 36 telegraph signals. That wire ran for about 20 years. And at that time, it was $12 or equivalent of about $100 a day for a 3-minute phone call, one of the 36 that this cable could handle. And they've continued to make TAT cables up to, I think the last one is now TAT 14, which ran from 2001 to 2020. These early cables are still entirely copper and various sealants around it. So the inner bands have the cluster of wires for each of the signals. So there's about 70 individual strands inside of that center casing. The bigger bands of copper that you see on these cables are actually for repeaters. When you're going to run a cable 3,000 kilometers long, signals will degrade over time, and so you'll need to insert repeaters on. So you have additional electricity pushed down the line to run those repeaters. And then the outer layers are waterproofing, armoring, and protection. The repeaters are big. These are 3-4 meters long, bulked out. They're taking each of those individual strands with a signal and reboosting the signal. They have a DC signal coming in, a power source to come in, and then they come back out the wire on the other side. So you have one of these roughly every 70 kilometers, you'll have a repeater on, say, a 3,000, 4,000 meter long cable, or kilometer long cable. And obviously that's gotten big. We have a lot of wires running all over the place. So the reality is the vast majority of data is communicated under the ocean. I know lots of folks are excited about things like Starlink. So this Starlink network represents about 7,000 operational satellites. But this is capable of moving about 1% of the data that moves across the internet at any given time. The bandwidth is pretty straightforward. Each of the modern versions of the Starlink satellite, they're called the V2 Mini, there are bigger ones coming, can handle about 60 gigabits of traffic in ideal conditions. They never quite handle that many. So times 7,000 of them, you get up to about 420 terabits total of data. That's the equivalent of one modern undersea cable. So, and there are 1,700 undersea cables of varying versions. So just to give you some proportionality here, Starlink is a last mile technology. It's not designed to move large volumes of data. If you want to move large volumes of data, you need fiber optic cable. And fiber optic cable really comes into play in the 80s. It's a far more complex technology than we think about. The actual process of making these things is crazy complicated. The center, of course, is glass, that little fiber core. It may or may not be hollow, but most of them are solid. Around that is a cladding. These are tiny. That's 100 microns across out to the cladding. Then a sealant coating, some buffering material so that it can handle some flexibility, and then various protective layers on top of that. To make that initial core and cladding, you start with a billet. So this is basically a block of glass, and it's sized and shaped for the kind of laser light you're going to put through it. If you get into buying fiber optic cable, you'll hear about single mode and multi-mode cables. Single modes are literally sized so that one frequency of laser light travels through it well, and multi-modes are designed for multiple frequencies. Nominally, depending on design and purpose, multimodal can handle more data because the more frequencies you have, the more places you have to put data. Single modes tend to be more focused, longer range. Now, there's a big difference between transatlantic or undersea cables and the typical cables we'd use in a data center or even across land. So there's a very specific area of the design to cables when we go to undersea cable. But on land, we don't have quite as many problems. It's important when we talk about laser light to think of that spectrum of different lights. The lower frequency lights, the more in the infrared, their bandwidth's a bit bigger, they bounce a little easier. They're more reflective material, but their data density is not as high. The higher frequency lights are higher. Of course, I'm showing you the whole spectrum here, and in reality, different elements produce different frequencies of laser light, so we only really have narrow bands that we can work in. So the process of deciding what you're going to put down a cable has to do with the quality of the laser you have and the frequencies it works in and the kind of glass you're working with that create these frequencies. Because they start out as just these big blocks of glass, very purified, and then they're heated and expanded and hollowed out, and then sprayed or deposited with different lining materials on the inside, depending on the kind of reflectivity that we need. And in the end, you end up with something 3, 4, 5 meters long, maybe half a meter in diameter, And to make a fiber from that, something thinner than a hair, you melt it in a crucible. So it's stacked into this crucible and heated up so that it drips out of the bottom of it, out of a carriage frame 50 to 60 meters tall. So I've had the opportunity to be in the Corning facility where they're making this, but you're literally pouring fiber out of the top of the crucible so that it cools and is wound onto a capstan at the bottom. Along the way, there's going to be various measurements and testing. Certain techniques actually will apply a coating as it's drawn, and in the end, you're going to result in some spool length. Some of these, like a 10,000 kilometer cable will take about 4 days to draw down from a series of billets. And you don't really know what you get till you finish. It's very much like building high-end microprocessors. You have to test it afterwards. So after they finish the draw, then they'll run that particular piece of fiber through a set of tests to see the quality of it and sell it to the quality standard that they have. So you can't order that precisely on cable. Cable's manufactured all of the time, and they'll come up with different results on it. It seems very analog, doesn't it? That we're literally dripping glass down a tower and winding it onto a capstan, but that's actually how it works. And in the end, you end up with this series of coatings. Now, this picture, which I think is a very clear one of how a fiber mate, is not well reflective of an undersea cable. An undersea cable tends to be what they call loose buffer. This is tight buffer, so it's quite rigid. A loose buffer cable has more fibers actually in it, but they're each floating in a gel matrix with a central rod around it. So these are different ways of sealing it. This particular cable you might use between data centers, because it's actually got too many. If this is a 48 fiber cable, you typically wouldn't use quite this many in an undersea cable lay. But you run multiple strands because you want to move more data. The expensive part is the laying. You're going to try and shove as much data out as you can. It's the repeaters that are going to be the hard part on this. So when you go to buy a chunk of fiber optic cable to lay across the ocean, it comes in various sizes, and ultimately you're going to use all of those sizes. Likely. Typically, you're going to stick with the lightest weight cable you possibly can. These are down the size of a small garden hose and mostly coating. And then on the inside, you have, again, those copper bands because we need to send electricity down that down that cable to provide energy for the repeaters. And then the individual fibers are going to be on the inside. And typically for undersea cables, they've been 6 or 12 strands. There are now starting to use some 24s as the technology gets better. And then you have levels of armoring depending on the risk to damage. So in the deep ocean, where there's relatively low risk, if you're just along a bottom, you're going to tend towards the lightest cable. And then as you go across a potentially tectonically active area, say the mid-Atlantic fault line, because you're laying a strand under the ocean across the Atlantic, you're going to cross that fault line. You'll go up to a level of armoring that it can tolerate more landslides, earthquakes, and disturbances. And then close to shore, where you might have drag issues, where there might be fishing or anchors or things like that, you'll use the heavier armored ones. The problem with the heavy armors is it's really heavy. Right? That lightweight cable, you're talking 200 kilograms per kilometer for the lightweight cable, where the double armor is about 1,500 kilograms, or 1.5 tons per kilometer, and priced accordingly. So in a given strand, a given lay, say it's a 4,000 kilometer lay, you might have heavy armor on both ends close to land, then go down to the very lightweight, and then you might armor up again as you go across the mid-Atlantic rift. Every cable is custom. When you're going to order a cable this long, you get to spec it out, but you need to have a plan for that. And then in intervals along that cable, you're going to insert these repeaters, and these repeaters are large. So 2 to 4 meters long, up to 30, 40 centimeters in diameter. Each fiber cable is individually broken up and optically boosted, powered by the copper lines that were added to that cable to provide the power along. And typically with fiber, you're talking about every 100 kilometers, you're going to have an amplifier. So for a 4,000 meter cable, there's going to be a 4,000 kilometer cable, you're going to have 40 of these repeaters in it. That cable then is laid into a drum, and you can see these folks are making sure it's stacking perfectly. This is on board a ship. And each time, every 100 kilometers when that repeater shows up, it's actually put into a carriage adjacent to the drum, and then the wind goes back into the drum again. And so it's set up so that as it's being put off the back of the ship, there's a crane that's going to pick each one of those repeaters up with the cable and put it on as it gets laid. So it's a series. We'll talk about the whole laying process. It's fascinating. But these cables are, again, assembled by specification, specific for the lay, specific to length, with the right kind of repeaters on it and the amount of fiber that you can put into it. So that is pure fiber optic data cabling. There are other undersea cables today you might see pictures of, typically for submersible wind turbines. This is a very unusual picture because these are floating turbines. There's virtually none of these. These are purely experimental today. Contemporary offshore turbines are anchored to the bottom, typically no more than 50 meters of water. They do a casement, they drill down through the bottom, they pour a bunch of concrete, they bit a big post, that's your wind turbine. But you need to get that power ashore, right? That's where it's needed. And so you lay this other style of cable with 3 big conductors in it, because it's 3-phase power. It'll also have a bit of fiber optic for the data communications on that. Also armored, and typically then sent all the way to shore where the work's going to be done. In some cases, collections of turbines will do a consolidation between them to a synchronized power that will be one going ashore, because all that copper costs money. So part of the challenge is keeping the cost down to be the most efficient. So let's walk through one submersible cable, one laid by Google, called the Donant cable. It's named after a mathematician. So laid from Virginia on the west side into France on the east side. This is a 6,600 kilometer long cable, 12 fibers in it, 250 terabit capacity at optimal running rate. So, and it's interesting to think that this contemporary cable, this cable was laid in 2020, is capable of carrying more data than every cable laid up till 1990. So the technology has continued to improve. We've got multimodal, multi-frequency. We're packing a lot of data into a given fiber. This cable costs about $200 million, and it'll last about 20 years before it starts to have enough breakage. It degrades over time. They'll start to lose a few fibers, and at some point it's no longer worth using, and they'll lay some more. So first you have to get your license agreement. So agreement at Virginia Beach, agreement at St. Hilaire, to be allowed to do a landing and tie into the broader internet. Once you have that agreement in place, then you actually take survey. You work with the surveys that are available under the ocean. You're figuring out where you're going to cross the mid-Atlantic rift, what other active tectonic areas you're going to have on that lay, because you're going to plan amount of armoring and tension on the cable. It's all going to sit on the bottom. And then you're going to order the cable to specification. Again, in this particular case, the cable is about 6,600 kilometers long. It's going to need a certain number of repeaters. In this case, I think about 70. And then you have to hire a ship. Good news is there's a set of ships who do this for a living. There's only a couple hundred of them in the world. This is actually the ship, the Reliance, that did the job. This company's called Subcom, and their business is laying undersea cables. All of their ships are active all of the time. You have to wait. You get your shift on this. And by the way, the Donant cable went beautifully. It was laid in 6 months flat, worked first try. Like, it was a perfect cable lay. When you're actually putting cable over the side on a ship like this, you're only running at about 10 kilometers per hour. And that's when you're away from the shoreline, right? Up shoreline, you'll be even much slower than that. But fast as this ship will go, and you're laying precisely. These ships are computer controlled. They go exactly over the point of the bottom they're supposed to go over. Winding cable out the back, which means roughly every 10 hours or so, you're putting a repeater off with that crane and putting it down as well. These ships are tough. They can handle pretty rough conditions, but if there's a hurricane coming, there is an option to stop where they will actually cut the cable and either put a float on it or put it to the bottom, get the ship out of the way, and then come back later, retrieve the cable off the bottom, splice it, and continue the lay. The Donant cable did not have any of those problems. They timed the weather perfectly, went all the way across in one pass. Now, the shoreline areas are where things get exciting. In the ocean, no big deal. But the shoreline areas, you want the cable to be buried. And so they have this sledge or plow that actually pushes the cable under the bottom. So, and it actually works backwards, where they'll come all the way to the shore, anchor the cable at the beach station, and then pull outward with the plow, digging the cable under somewhere between 1 and 4 meters. These days we tend to dig deeper because we can. So the bottom really matters. Is it sand? Is it mud? Because if it's rock, you're not going to be able to bury it. And ultimately that cable is buried until you get to about 200 meters of water. That's deep enough that at that point you're not likely to be disturbed. You'll go back, you'll now get rid of the plow, just do surface lays and finish the rest of the run there. On the shore side, you're going to have a concrete box, right? They call the beach manhole. This is where that fiber optic cable actually ends. The inside of this box is typically pretty boring. You have the wet side cable. You can see it on the left there that came in from the beach and through the sand, comes up to a terminator, to a dry side cable that's going to go up to the land side connection to the rest of the internet. So the beach manholes tend to be very minimal, although there's some exceptions to this. There's no one right way to set up a cable, but they're trying to keep the beach manholes minimal because there's water incursions and problems like that. Further up in the land, somewhere up at the cable landing station is where you're going to take that fiber and you're going to break it out, switch over to TCP/IP. The blue cabinet you see in the middle of the room here is the actual data handling part, so it's taking the fiber, connecting to the internet, and so forth. Everything else around it is power and testing equipment for the cable. Remember, you're shoving a lot of DC power down that cable to power all those repeaters, and you're doing that from both sides. And you're doing signal monitoring to make sure the cables are behaving much the power's all right. So it's much more electrical handling than it is data. The data handling is the hard part. Or the power handling is the hard part. Data handling is pretty straightforward. So that's one cable. And you have termination sites on both ends. Often these days, you're running multiple cables to the same sort of landing site, so there'll be multiple beach manholes, but they'll all be coming to the same cable landing station. So, you get all that installed, you've got your bandwidth, and it's very normal now that even in the case of a company like Google, once that cable's up and operational, they'll add it to the telecom pool. So there are cross-licensing agreements with all the cable layers, typically the big telcos, but now also the tech giants, to share each other's cables. So if one cable goes down, you can get bandwidth on the other cable, so you make a contribution with your cables in, and now you have access to a certain amount of bandwidth with the others. They also typically have service agreements as well, so priority for repairs to cable, because bad things happen to cables. So what's the usual issue for cables? Well, normally earthquakes can occasionally damage cables, typically offshore landslides. The mid-Atlantic fault is certainly an issue. All of Pacific, which is the Ring of Fire, has earthquake zones and volcanic zones that can damage wires as well. And then it's fishing and anchorage. So what you're looking at here is a drag by an anchor damaging the cable fairly extensively. So what happens, and believe me, cable damage is not that unusual. It is normal today with about 1,700 cables running in the world to have about 100 to 200 cable faults in a year. Some of them minor, some of them major. There's a bunch of different strategies on how to deal with it. There'll be a lot of testing going on. They do communication, try and figure out if they can work around the problem. But if they need to repair the cable, there are dedicated ships for that. And those ships are a little bit different. They're cable laying ships and cable repair ships are similar but not the same. Now, you're only going to use a ship like the Intrepid if it's deep water. So this is the kind of ship that can go out, locate the cable from the bottom, figure out where the damage is, and do the repairs on it. They are able to locate the cable by actually running voltage spikes through the DC side and then using a magnetometer to measure the spike to figure out pretty closely where it is. Each of the repeaters has a signature as well, so typically when you have a data error, you're going to know what between the two repeaters where it is, so you'll be within 100 kilometers anyway, so you know roughly where to go, and you do the magnetometer triangulation to get closer. If it's not a deep sea problem, you're not going to use a ship like this. If it's up close to the shore, you're going to use a barge. It's cheaper. Locating is easier, but basically has the same equipment on it. It's just it's a motorized barge. They position it in the right place. It has impellers to keep it exactly over the cable. And this is typically for repairing anchor drags, the most common problem. Now, how do you actually do the fixes? These days, it's well issue with ROVs. And once upon a time, we sent people down. That's really dangerous. We have good robotics now. This little bot is not that small. This is SUV sized. And it's capable of doing some classes of repair directly on the bottom. So after you've done your locator, you're going to use the crane to drop this drone down to the bottom. It's on a tether. The operators are typically not even on the ship these days. They're Starlink, they're back at home, so they don't have to be shipside, and they're playing the video game of finding the cable. And for minor repairs, they literally can do them on the bottom. For major repairs, where they need to bring it up, this machine will then put a harness onto the cable. So you're trying to protect the area where the damage is, or you're cutting out the area and lifting the two ends to do a splice. But that harness actually then can attach to a crane. So this is a look at a repaired cable about to be put back down. That white block on the left side is the splice room. So the top of the roof of the splice room will open up, and they will lift that cable over and into the splice room so that the repair guys can work inside to actually cut away the damaged parts of the cable, and then they literally have a splicing kit. They'll probably add a kilometer or so of cable in as well while they're doing this. So they'll repair the splice ends on one side, all the fibers, and then go to the other end, splice it on the other end, then put it in a housing, into that harness, lift the entire thing back out of the room, put it over the side. Pricey work, but cables are valuable, and repairing them is cheaper than laying new ones. So, where do we have problems with cables? It's typically in the pinch points, busy areas. So one area that we've had problems right now, is at the front side of the Suez Canal. So this is the Eastern Mediterranean. This is Egypt and the Levant. So we have a ton of cables that run through the Suez Canal. It's a good shortcut. And that area around Port Said on the north side there is lots of anchorage as well. There are very specific areas where we're supposed to anchor. All these cables are marked on the oceanographic maps. You're not supposed to anchor there, but it happens. And in fact, just this past September, one of the very longest cables in the entire world, the SEMEWE3 cable, so that is Southeast Asia to Mediterranean to Western Europe, a 39,000 kilometer cable, got damaged at Port Said. This was the message from Azure while this problem was going on. So if you had paid for a Cosmos DB low latency data connection, this was basically a message saying, hey, we may not be able to deliver on this right now because we're counting on this cable, and this cable's currently been damaged. It was an anchor drag that was found and fixed within a couple of months. So it's repaired now, but this is what happens. And they used a barge lift near Port Said, did the repairs, got the cable up and running again. By the way, to lay a 30, typically the ships that lay these cables can only handle about 10,000 kilometers of cable at a time. So for a 39,000 kilometer cable, you use more ships. And there'll be this meeting point in the ocean where one ship has finished its lay and the end of its cable will have a float, and it'll put it in the water, and then that ship will move away. The next ship will come and pick up the float, put it in the splice room, put the beginning of their cable onto that, splice it together, and then continue the next 10,000 kilometers. And then they did it again. And then they did it again. A 39,000 kilometer cable is crazy long. There's that's about as long as it gets. They're literally talking from Western Europe, across the Mediterranean, all the way across the Indian Ocean, through the Straits of Malacca, and up into Southeast Asia. Speaking of Southeast Asia, the Straits of Malacca and around Singapore are another major pinch point of cables. So all those cables coming from the Europe side and around Africa come down around that point in Malacca, and then up into China, Japan, the Philippines, and even on from there to North America, although typically separate cables. So all of these are challenging spots. During the economic downturn in 2008 and 2009, a lot of ships that were needed at the time, because there was not a lot of traffic, were illegally anchored off the coast of Singapore and left for a year or two. It takes a couple of years to remove a ship like that. And so your team sort of drops the ship off, then you sneak off in the middle of the night, and before they have a chance to actually get that ship removed, business is back up again, your crew shows up, lights it up, bugs out in the middle of the night. It's much cheaper than finding real parking, right? And those ships did anchor drags, damaged cables and things. It was problematic. But the area we probably want to talk about is the Baltics, because there's been some interesting activity in the Baltic Sea the past few years. Back in 2021, a set of cables running on the west coast of Norway up to Svalbard, the Spitsbergen Islands, mysteriously had problems after Russian trawlers were found in the area. And the argument is that they were actually practicing techniques for dragging cables. Because fast forward a few years, in 2022, with the Ukraine activity going on in full steam, we had an incident with the Nord Stream pipelines. Now, to be clear, in 2021, Russia was supplying about 45% of gas to the EU through the Nord Stream 1 pipeline. The Nord Stream 2 pipeline had been finished, but it had never been commissioned. They pressurized it, it had not gone into operation. But all lines were shut down in February of 22 when the invasion started. But you keep those lines pressurized with natural gas. Even though you're not pumping, you keep them under pressure to keep them stable. And in September of 22, there were a series of explosions that destroyed all 4 pipes. The Nord Stream 1 and 2 are paired pipes, and all of them exploded roughly on the same day. So the boiling you see here is the gas escaping through the rupture in the line that was already in the pressurized line. There was some evidence that it was a Ukrainian activity. That was probably a false flag. There's a real debate as to exactly who did this. Apparently the Swedes know, they're just not saying. But those pipelines are still ruptured to this day, and nobody really inclined to do anything about that. Let's move fast forward, also in the Baltic Sea. So this is November of 24, when a Chinese ship named the Yiping 3 left out of Russia, headed west, and as it passed Gotland, Gotland Island, the BCS east-west cable abruptly went offline. That's between Lithuania and Gotland. And then another cable was cut as well. So there was the two cuts, and they were found, while these were panicked about this, Yiping made it all the way to Denmark and stopped. There was a Danish television station, a public radio television station that paid for a drone to fly out to that ship where they noticed it was missing an anchor. And so the argument is that it had dragged anchor for several kilometers. There was an investigation, a bunch of officials came there, the ship was allowed to continue on, it was declared an accident. Now to be clear, these are 30-ton anchors. They're really big. They have multiple safety systems to keep them in place. It is extremely difficult to accidentally drop an anchor this big. Now, admittedly, your ship's large, the anchor's a fair ways away. But once it gets to the bottom, it kind of affects your navigation. Like we can see on the AIS, we know exactly when the Yiping's anchor hit the bottom because oddly enough, the ship slowed down and started changing direction. And its autopilot fought it for some time, but it went on for a long while. So this was a very unusual event. But it was a Chinese ship, it was let go. It didn't stop, though. It continued. So in December of 24, the Eagle S, this time dragged across a power cable, the S-Link cable between Estonia and Finland, but also a set of data cables owned by a company named Eliza, tore two of those, as they described it, torn apart by external forces. The Finns had just joined NATO, so they actually chased down the Eagle S while it was still running and realized it was also missing an anchor. They then boarded the ship and used a never-before-used law of the sea under the UN agreement to seize control of the ship, move it into Finnish waters, arrested the crew. The crew said they knew nothing about what was going on, that they hadn't done anything with an anchor. So the Finns, being the Finns, went and found the anchor. They got a submersible, figured out where it was, mapped out the drag line that had gone across the cables. This is the anchor. You will notice there are things missing from the anchor. The anchor is supposed to look like this. See the long metal bits? They're gone. They had dragged that anchor almost 100 kilometers along the bottom, tearing up everything, including those two cables. As a result of that process, they utilized this law to seize 35,000 tons of unleaded refined gasoline and sell it on the open market to pay for the repairs. The data cable was repaired in 2 months. The power cable that was cut took almost a year to repair. It's much more challenging to do that. And then asked the Russians if they wanted their ship back. And a month later, the Swedes seized the cargo vessel Vänsen after it dragged across a Latvian-Swedish cable and broke it. So we've now seen that this law worked. Same thing, took the cargo, sold it to do the repairs, released the ship. And mysteriously, the anchor drag stopped. You know, after like 3 or 4 in a matter of a few weeks, and a dozen over the past couple of years, they stopped. One of the things that happened was that there was a NATO initiative called Baltic Sentry put together. So this was ships from the Baltic states that are in NATO, so that's Germany, Sweden, Norway, Finland, Denmark, all providing ships, aircraft, and drones, imaging every single shipping vessel moving in the Baltic to monitor the position of their anchors and intercepting that ship if anything happens with their anchors fairly quickly. This is also the period in just last year in September when we started having the drone problems in Oslo and in Copenhagen and Stadstrup. And then eventually the French seized that ship as it came around and drones started appearing over a French military base. No sense of humor. And then we went quiet for almost a year until this past New Year's Eve, when yet another ship coming out of Russia tore up that poor ELISA data cable that had been ripped up the year before. This time, the Finns were there the moment the cable went down. They were already monitoring the ship. They thought there was an issue. When ELISA reported the cable went down, the Finns intercepted the ship, seized the cargo. They still have the ship in impound and are negotiating for if and when it's going to be released. And just this month, the Finns have now a new maritime monitoring system they're putting into place to further the monitoring, actually in an agreement with the EU. So outside of NATO, more additional marine monitoring going on. So this is being taken very seriously in terms of controlling the amount of what's moving around. The challenge with the Baltic is the bottom's relatively shallow. So, most cables get deep enough, nobody's going to touch them. But the Baltic Sea never gets deep enough. At almost any point along the route of the Baltic, you can throw an anchor and scrape the bottom. It's 100 meters, 150 meters at most. It's not the only place where this kind of activity is taking place. Just last year, there was cable cuts off the coast of Taiwan, a set of islands called the Matsus, and there are undersea cables that run across to China. There was an incident there, that happened in February of 2025. Ships were identified through AIS, and the Taiwanese charged a Chinese captain with doing the damage. The Chinese have now responded by saying it was the Taiwanese fault. Right. This is a kind of warfare, right? We depend on these cables, and you have to think about what would, the scope of the problem. Like, if you really wanted to cripple a country, what would be the impact of cutting all of those cables? Like, right now, we're just playing with a few. It's kind of a bit of a terrorism game. But if you got more serious about it, and I went looking for some kind of view on this, and I found one, and it actually involves a volcanic eruption. Not that long ago. This is in 2022 in Tonga. This is the Hunga Tonga Ha'apai eruption. I don't know if you remember this. This is a semi-underwater volcano. It was part of an island that had a part of the crater above the water, but mostly flooded. And as the eruption began, it collapsed, and all the ocean rushed in, and there was a massive steam explosion. Massive as in went around the world 3 times measurable on barometric measures. So you saw the echo of this bang going around and around the planet. It kicked off a 20-meter high tsunami wave that hit the Tongan Islands. Unfortunately, the Tongans are very experienced. They knew what to do. There was, I think, 4 fatalities total, which is still a crisis, but all of Tonga went offline all at the same time. So nobody really knew what was going on. Their cell phones just stopped working. The towers were there. The island hadn't been destroyed or anything, but they were completely unable to communicate in any way. So the folks outside of Tonga are wondering what they are aware of the eruption trying to communicate in. The Tonganese are trying to communicate out. Nothing's working. Somebody in the government remembers they have a sat phone after a few days, so they dig the old sat phone out, charge it up because nobody's used it for a while, find out the account has expired, and all they need to do is log into the internet and recharge it. Managed to get online after 5 days to say, okay, we've done a check of the islands, here's our situation, this is what help we need, help is rushing in. Elon provided some Starlink panels, but it took a while for them to get there. They were fully offline, and eventually they found out the reason was that the explosion had blown 100 kilometers out of the only undersea cable that went to Tonga. The reason their cell phones were offline is that the EMEA identifiers, which is basically your login for your cell phone to be allowed to use a network, the controller was in Japan. So when the cable went down, even though there was a working network there, you couldn't actually log into that network. So there's a DR correction to do, plus keep the sat phone charged. Their whole banking system was down until they could repair the cable, and they were missing enough cable they had to manufacture more cable. So the ship came, first thing was, I think our undersea cable's down, so you get the repair ship in to repair it. It eventually finds the damaged end and goes, you're missing a whole bunch of cable. You're gonna have to get that cable made. So we'll see you later. And they left it. It took 6 months to make the cable and another 6 months to get the ship back, so it was over a year before they reconnected. In the meantime, their banking system was done by spreadsheet and USB key. So you were basically trusted that your transactions were legitimate, and they would put your entries down in a spreadsheet, and then each of the islands would submit a USB key to the central bank at Tonga to consolidate all of that until they could get data connectivity back up again. All the solar panels in Tonga stopped operating after 3 months because they didn't get software updates. And so they just shut themselves off without current software. Thanks. Interesting set of DR experiences, but it speaks to the dependency we have on data communications. And so we have this little sample of this great society on these small islands that was dependent on a single cable. And when it was down, a whole lot of modern technology went down with it. So it's part of something we need to think about as technology professionals about where those dependencies live exactly. Also on the military side, there is a whole other undersea business. So during the Cold War, the Americans were very aware that the Soviet submarine bases were all based out of Archangel and Murmansk on the Arctic Ocean. And so for them to get into the Atlantic Ocean, they had to pass through this gap between Greenland, Iceland, and the United Kingdom. And so they lined that area with sonobuoys, basically sensor systems anchored on the bottom with a set of floats with arrays of hydrophones so that they could identify any submarines moving in the area. And during the height of the Cold War, the Americans operated hunter-killer submarines that would literally follow every single nuclear-capable Soviet submarine. So the American 688s would hang out around the Iceland area, waiting for one of the Soviet submarines to come through. It would be detected by this array, and then it would be followed the entire time it was operating. We only found out about most of this post-end of the Cold War. And even the array, for the most part, is completely secret. One of the few pictures we have of any of it is one of these sensors that broke away in a storm and washed up on the coast of Iceland. So those are individual sono sensors in a big array, one on top of the other. This was actually the system that detected the Titan submersible implosion. If you remember that, the folks that were trying to get down to the Titanic killed a billionaire and his son and a few others. And it took a while for them to say, oh, actually, we have a recording of it. It's because it was this secret sensor array, and they took a while to say, okay, well, we'll share this data with you. Here's the moment of the implosion. But it speaks to the whole drone activity that's starting to go on. So there's a whole conversation going about these unmanned undersea vehicles. There's an argument now that, especially in places like the Baltic where there's so much activity going on, that eventually there's going to be drones in the water monitoring all of those cables all of the time, quite possibly even following ships of suspect. So there's a whole area of further exploration, both for conflict-related reasons as well as just knowledge, understanding more of the sea with smart unmanned drones, maintaining these cables as well as understanding the activity that's actually going on under there. Going forward, there's more data density coming. So these days, we're typically laying 480 terabit cables. So that's about twice the capacity of all of Starlink in one cable. There's plans for 960s. This is mostly limited by the scope of the repeaters. Can we shove enough electricity down the line to run enough repeaters to repeat that much data on those many cables? But as repeaters are getting more efficient, and more power efficient, we'll be able to put more and more data into that. So the new cables are even going further and moving more data, because we're just simply not running. We don't seem to have a limit on the amount of data we need. There have been plans with the climate changes is that to run cables through the Arctic now. There was for a while an agreement for Finland and Russia to run a cable, but they're not doing that much anymore. But there's definite designs for a cable running from Western Europe, UK, under the Arctic Sea directly to Japan. So that would be about an 8,000 kilometer cable as opposed to going 40,000 kilometers around the long way. Just because the ice pack is low enough now, they should be able to get that cable down to the bottom. So that's called the Far North Fiber Express, running between Europe, Japan, and Asia. Most cables today, well, were up till a few years ago, cables were laid by the telcos, by the Verizons and AT&Ts and BTs of the world. Most cables today are laid by the tech giants, Microsoft, Amazon, Google. They do contribute those cables into the same telco pools, but they're the ones laying those cables down. primarily to provide maximum bandwidth and low latency consistency between their major data centers. So this story arc is not stopping. We're going to keep laying more cables. We're going to pack more data into it. Our data consumption only seems to be going up. The number of data centers only seems to be going up as well. And our dependency on them only gets larger. And so they need to protect them. There's now a whole conversation about no longer documenting where these cables go. Because if they're on the maps, then they're easy to find. And if they're not on the maps, then maybe it's less likely that folks will intentionally attack them. That's the sort of current state of conversation on all this. I hope this was useful for you. I find this whole business fascinating, and obviously it's an ongoing evolution. And just a reminder, you can't do this with satellites. You can't pack this much data through the air. You need the undersea map. It's never going to go away, not with the way we currently work. Thanks for your time. Appreciate it.